worked at in, oh, good, it's recording. And that yeah,
Yes,
so
I'm
this
sorry. I
scientific,
forgot to start that earlier. So,
no worries, no worries. I had the opportunity to work at this farm in Puerto Rico and a number of other places, but it gave me the opportunity to kind of work with the land with my hands and start to also appreciate like the relationship that the people that I was working with also had with the land that they had been taken care of and had kind of transformed. And that was a really powerful experience for me. And that was ultimately one of the reasons that when I came back to Maine, I joined the Maine Master Naturalist program and have since done a couple of presentations. This is actually one of my first ones that I'm doing completely on my own. So I'm excited and nervous at the same time, but mostly excited. That's a little bit about me and kind of why I'm interested in this talk in particular. Um, and yeah, and mostly also just because mushrooms are really cool and it's really interesting to see how especially since the I mean like the study of mycology has been around since like the 1700s, but we haven't really even thought about fungi as their own kingdom on it was until it was like the 60s or the 70s before they were kind of classified as non-flowering plants, which I just thought was kind of interesting, that like it's still pretty recent that we're really getting into the weeds, so to speak, of like what what a fungus actually is and the roles that they play in the ecosystem. So yeah, so we're going to talk about mushrooms today in case you couldn't tell. And these are just some of the like thesis questions that I had as I was going through the presentation. Um, and basically just looking at like what a fungus is and how it makes its living, how it eats and reproduces and things like that, and also the roles that they play in the ecosystem. And most importantly, which we're going to get to towards the very end, is how do you know what type of mushroom you're looking at when you're looking at a mushroom? These are all questions that are relevant any time of year, but these ones are at least going to be helpful for us tonight when we're talking about all sorts of fungi, and then we're going to get into the weeds of like the specifics that we might see this time of year if you were to go outside right now. I know it's cold, but if you were to go out, you might see certain types. So we're going to talk about that later. Um, so what is a fungus? We're just going to talk about like the basics of what defines the category so that we kind of all know what we're talking about. Um, so fungi are heterotrophic, meaning that they can't make their own food, so they have to obtain it elsewhere. And they are primarily made of chitin, like some animals. And specifically like the exoskeletons of arthropods and insects and things like that. So it's pretty tough material, but like you'll also notice that there are some mushrooms that are made of chitin but still really soft. And that's part of the way that they're structured, and the way that the individual cells are structured. But that's just the basics that the basic two steps. The third step is they reproduce by spores. Some plants also do that, like ferns, but all fungi reproduce by spores. They're immobile, so like some plants, of course, and they digest externally, like a lot of arthropods, and I think there are some like slugs and microbacteria that also digest that way. But basically, they just secrete enzymes which break down the organic material, and then they absorb it. And it's basically digesting it and breaking it down chemically rather than physically like chewing on it. Those are just the 5 points that define a fungus. And everything else we'll get into a little bit later, but that's just the basics that we got to know about right now. Fungi are actually more closely related to animals than plants, which is also just something that's kind of interesting to put into perspective. Um, but yeah, so basic outline of just what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about the life cycle and just kind of what the life of a fungus looks like, as well as the roles that they play in the ecosystem. And then we'll have a little bit of a talk about how they partner up with other plants and trees, which is why I wrote Trees Are Friends, because we'll get to talk a little bit about how they form these symbiotic relationships that are also really crucial for understanding their roles in the ecosystem and things like that. And then the second half of the presentation is going to be about specific mushroom identification, and we're going to look at like some a couple of different species and also just the general types of fungi that you might find. And then we'll get into just a couple of other details from there. And then we'll leave time for questions. But that's the general ride that we're going to take today. And we'll move on to the life cycle of a mushroom. I technically call it a mushroom. Mushroom is the fruiting body of the full organism. Um, but but yeah, so basically we're going to talk about just these are just four different steps that I decided to kind of point out along the way. It's kind of hard, it's not always easy to tell the difference between like, okay, when is a spore stop and the growth starts and then the root product, but these are the kind of just the basic stops that we're going to take as we're looking at the life cycle of how fungi live. Spores, they reproduce by these spores, which are just these tiny microscopic, they function a lot like seeds. They're sort of analogous to seeds with plants, except spores are haploid, meaning that they have half their parents' DNA. And this was actually something that I wasn't super or familiar with when I first started doing research for this presentation. But then as I was looking into it, I was like, I just found a rabbit hole of so much information that I like was really just blown away by. Um, but the basic thing that we want to just remember is that they're haploid, so they have 50% of their DNA, and they're meant to just float on the air, and that's the primary way that they're dispersed. Sometimes, like the picture here shows these fungi that are, or these mushrooms that are facing upward, and their goal is to spread them into the air and get them to, float away as far as possible. But obviously, we'll see other types and species if you see like, the standard cap and stem kind of shape, a lot of those spores are going to be facing downward. But the basic idea is the same, is that they're trying to just give them the best chance to disperse and hopefully find a good spot to land and start growing. And I think this next part, okay, yeah, so when they land, and this was something that I didn't have a lot of context for until I started doing more research. But when they land, the haploids will start putting out little hyphae, which are the single cells of the mycelium, which make up the roots, or like the majority of the organism is going to be in the roots that start growing as the haploid starts growing out into the soil. This one is particularly interested in the minerals in the soil and getting the minerals out of the rock, and also all of the like moisture that it can get at. Fungi are really good at accessing nutrients as well as moisture and redistributing it throughout the soil, and also able to use it to make themselves grow. And so this was my little way of trying to draw two little haploids that just happened to land nearby, and they start kind of growing. And then once their roots meet up with each other, they're like, "Oh, are you a haploid that also is part of the species?" And they're like, "Yeah, I'm a haploid. Do you want to like get together?" And they'll be like, "Sure, why not?" So then they this is a part that I had a hard time wrapping my head around, but they essentially like they have this way of like drilling into each other's roots, is my understanding, where they're able to like form a single individual. And basically that's the way that they become like genetically individual from their parents, is through this process of these haploids meeting. And they both each have 50% of their parents' DNA. And basically the only qualification is that they need to be a compatible mating type. So they can't be both the exact same mating type. Um, my understanding is that they just need to be a compatible one. And this was also a part that was really interesting, was that there were multiple species that have more than two mating types. So there are some species that'll have like 30 mating types. There are others that are in the hundreds of mating types. And so if you're going to like, and make that analogous to humans, humans have technically two mating types, right? But I just thought that was so interesting, is that there are some fungi that just have so many different mating types that some of them are compatible, some of them aren't. And there's still a lot of research to be done, but I just thought that was really interesting to mention. Not that that necessarily helps too much with identification, but it was just really cool to me to think about how just vastly different the lives of fungi are compared to, I mean, really like any other species or any other like kingdom. But it is just really interesting to think about how like the ways that they've evolved to reproduce and to become genetically different from their parents. I just think that's so interesting. So that's the basics of how they get from a spore to the body, to the mycelium, to the individual organism that's getting to eventually produce its own spores and start to reproduce. So this is the second stop where we're going to talk about just how they make their living, the ways that they obtain nutrients so that they're able to grow. So they're saprotrophs, meaning that they eat dead organic material, primarily decaying wood, but that varies greatly between species. Some of them will like only eat specific types of wood, and some of them are so specific to like species, whereas others are like, I'm just gonna eat whatever I find. Ultimately, if you're a spore and you're landing somewhere, you just hope that you land on substrate that's gonna survive, that's gonna, sustain you. Right. So that's kind of the basic idea here. And some of them are specifically carnivores, where they'll eat living animals, actually, which was, I didn't fully understand that until I joined the Maine Master Naturalist program. But they will actually eat small invertebrates. We'll talk about one species that I know does that later on in the presentation. But it's really interesting how they're able to do that. They essentially like produce this enzyme that some of them produce an enzyme that is able to like paralyze small invertebrates. Some have developed different ways, but that is one way that some fungi can obtain nutrients. There's of course parasites, which are kind of similar to saprotrophs, and meaning that they attack and consume organic material, but it's living material, so they have a parasitic relationship. Usually it's going to be with plants in particular. So you could kind of think of it as like herbivores, but they have a parasitic relationship with the plants. So there's that. And then we're going to talk about mycorrhizal relationships, which is a section later on in this presentation that I wanted to make time for because I find it really fascinating. And it's also really helpful to think about when we're talking about identification. But basically, the mycorrhizal fungi form these symbiotic relationships with plants and trees in order to exchange nutrients. Usually plants are providing things like carbohydrates in exchange for the fungi providing them nitrogen and phosphorus and other things in the soil and things like that, things that are harder for the plants to get to themselves. The mycorrhizal fungi will make it available to them. And also they'll like share water and things like that. So they eat, and that was just another thing that I wanted to cover, is that some fungi will have, they'll take, whatever they can get. So if they happen to land on, dead organic matter, that's great. But if they happen to land and they, have the opportunity to, eat a certain type of tree, or if some nematodes come by and they want to just like crunch on those real fast, they'll take advantage of that. And so they're not always exclusively like saprotrophs or exclusively parasites, but Some of them can kind of vary. So those are the big four that we're going to talk about today. And I don't remember if I had another part. Okay, so this is another part of the growth stop that I just want to talk about is kind of the terms for the different parts of the mushroom, since that is the whole mushroom is the fruiting body of the mycelium of the individual itself. So that is the part that actually reproduces and disperses the spores. And these are the parts that we're talking about when we're specifically looking at mushrooms and mushrooms identification. So we're going to talk about so like the cap, which just the top part. This is a specifically this mushroom is an Amanita muscaria, but the specifically what I would call it if I didn't know what it was called is like a cap and stem mushroom with gills underneath. This one happens to have gills. But some cap and stem mushrooms will also have pores. And gills are just basically these like I don't know how to call them, but they're basically like these vertical lines that sometimes will run down the stem, but they typically are underneath the cap. And we'll look at what pores look like later. But the stem and then the skirt, or it's technically remnants of what's called the universal veil, which for some species is like this kind of skin that grows over the cap while it's still developing. That's something that is like typical of these sorts of mushrooms, but again, they're not always there. This is just kind of what you might expect if you were to look at these types of mushrooms. And then I mentioned hyphae before, and I tried to I tried to make this little diagram. I hope that's kind of clear, but yeah, so the hypha is specifically one cell of the mycelium, and they basically grow in these like single cell chains. Some of them are thinner than a human hair. They're usually visible if you lift up the soil carefully around it, for example, or if you were to like look in whatever the substrate is. The mycelium itself will be visible. The hyphae might be a little bit too small individually, but those are what make up the roots, the whole of the not the whole, but the majority of the organism. In this case, with these cap and stem kind of mushrooms that are growing in the soil, a lot of that's going to be in the soil, but the mycelium will also be, whatever the spores landed on, is where it'll start growing. And I think the next slide. Okay, yeah. So these are also just some terms that are kind of useful to remember. We talked about chitin before, and lignin is another part of and specifically the part of the wood that the mushrooms are really looking for in terms of getting their nutrients, because that is part of the thing that helps give them some of their structure, especially the like woodier ones. These were two pictures that I took of the top one is a polypore of some kind. I'm assuming it's some kind of reishi, but I haven't gotten all the way down to species. These bottom ones are some sort of toothed turkey tails from below. And both of them, I guarantee, like if I were to stand on this top photo of the reishi there, it would probably support my weight. Like they can be really tough. I have an example here of one that I how would I describe that? I dried out once I found it. But even when I found it, it was still really hard. And that is all the chitin. It basically gets arranged in these with these very tough like polypores, otherwise known as conchs, or bracket fungi. But these ones are specifically going to be really tough. But the chitin is sort of arranged in these kind of vertical tubes almost that end up making it really rigid and solid. So these are just some of the terms that I think are going to be useful as we're going forward. Because I also use kind of conchs and brackets interchangeably. But that basically just is kind of an informal term referring to polypores, specifically ones that have pores underneath. but we'll also talk about some that are also, these softer kind of ones that have gills as well. And we'll get into all sorts of other shenanigans, but these are the two major types that I wanted to talk about was these kind of cap and stem ones and the shelf kind of polypore ones, because those are the big ones that we would probably find this time of year. And reproduction. So now we're going to get into a little bit more of what the reproductive structures look like. And I mentioned them before, but basically just the gills are, this was a description that I found. Gosh, I wish I could remember exactly where it was from, but I found it helpful to have this kind of description of gills where they're these plate-like structures arranged radially on the underside of the cap. These are obviously meant to produce spores. The spores, I think, technically come out of the very ends of them. But yeah, so they're arranged radially. Some of them we'll talk a little bit more about the terms that you might see in a guidebook, for example, of like what the gills look like and the different forms that those can take to kind of get you down to like a genus or a species of a certain mushroom. But that's the basic thing about gills. Pores, I tried to I tried to use a good picture that I had, but it was also on my phone, so it may not be the most clear. But pores are just the openings of these of tubes, which are sort of the analogous to gills, where there are these hollow cylindrical structures underneath the cap. This specific specimen that I found was actually, if I zoomed out, I may even have a picture later on in the presentation of it, but it was basically just this, it might have even been a crust fungi that was growing over the face of a log. And so I had this really good view of just all of the pores that were forming. But that's the basic idea of just what those look like, is kind of all of these very close together little holes that are there to distribute all of the spores. And so those are the basic things that we're going to see, at least between most species. There are some exceptions that we'll get into later, but that's just the basic stop along the way. Yeah, and so then gills. So there's just a couple of different ways that they can be arranged. I found these terms kind of helpful just because I see them sometimes in guidebooks as well. But basically, free gills are ones that are going to be separate from the stem, at least by a little bit. The notched ones, sometimes they're called emerginate. That's one of those words that I've seen, emerginate maybe, that I've seen written down, but I haven't actually like said out loud. But notched is a lot like the free gills, where they're almost separate from the stem, but then they have this little part that's still kind of connected. Then you have the attached kind, which are completely attached to the stem. And then you have decurrent, which are, or like running down the length of the stem. These aren't, some guides will call them slightly different things, but these are just the little kind of details that are helpful to notice when you're looking at a specific species and you're looking at a specific specimen and you want to try to get it down to genus or species. Is taking note of some of these little details, because that can be a really huge indicator between certain species. And did I have another one in that? I didn't. Okay, so I don't. So then I called this Death and Other Magic Tricks because it kind of segues into the role that fungi play in the ecosystem. But I do want to mention these because it's really helpful just to think about just to think about what they do in the environment and in the different ways that they interact with other individuals around them. So fungi make up about 90% of all the organic matter in the soil. They are very integral to our layer of topsoil, basically everything above bedrock. They are also still capable of drilling into bedrock, and we'll get into some of that a little bit later. But so the living and dead mycelium itself makes up a huge percentage of the organic matter in the soil. And so that's why they're really crucial for redistributing nutrients and water and things like that is because not only are they big ubiquitous, they're everywhere, but also they're able to grow really quickly and spread pretty far distances um, in order to redistribute some of those nutrients. And that was also something else that I didn't know about when I was getting into this presentation. I knew that they were able to redistribute nutrients in water and things like that, but I didn't realize that both living and dead, depending on some of the species, are also able to do this. At least in when they die, when a fungi dies, ultimately all of that organic material gets turned back into the soil effectively. And That's something that also kind of makes it difficult to study ancient fungi and how long they've been around, is because they obviously make up a majority of the soil. So, unless you find like a really good fossil of one or like mycelium or something like that, then it's going to be pretty hard to find evidence of ancient fungi. That doesn't mean that they weren't there, but it is something just to kind of keep in mind, is that they really are integral to the just all of the soil that we have on Earth. Oh, and that was just another thing that I don't think I mentioned, was just that they hold up the literal structure of the soil, along with the plant roots, but mycelium in particular are hugely integral to holding up the all of the soil that we stand on, and also that all of the plants and trees in particular have to root into. And without them, we would probably not be here, actually. A lot of the land that we're on would not look anything like it does today. So that's kind of just what I wanted to talk about there, was just even in them not doing anything in particular to make their living or anything like that, they still, just by living and dying, they they have all of these functions in the ecosystem, which I just think is super cool. And I think that might be the last one for that one. Oh yeah, I threw a fun fact in here because I thought this was really cool. I was looking it up, and I'm going to try to say it. Pestilotiopisis microspora is a specific species of a cap and stem gill mushroom that can actually grow on polyurethane, which is a polymer in plastic, and it can use it as its sole carbon source, which I thought was really crazy. That it can actually it can re-uptake all of that carbon and turn it back into organic material, which is just so amazing to me. Like I didn't I also that was one of those things that I was like, is that true? And then as I was looking it up, I was like, oh my gosh, that's just so cool. That they're actually able to do that. There's some, I think I make another point later on some other species that can do some cool things like that too. But I just thought that was super fun. I just kind of had to throw that in there. That they can just they really can do so much for us. And that's just like one cool thing that one cool species can do. So I just had to throw that in there. Okay. Oh, yes. Okay. So then we're going to talk about their ecological niches and just kind of the basic roles that all sorts of fungi can play in the ecosystem. We talked a little bit about how they break down dead plant material and other organic matter in soil. Also, I know that there are some, I think this would probably count as saprotrophic fungi, where they can also break down dead animal material as well and other things like that. So organic material in general, they're really good at breaking down. There are also some species, I know that there are some species of trees that, because of how tough their lignin is, the only thing that's even capable of breaking them down is like certain species of fungi that they partner with. And so some of them have really crucial roles to play in the environment. So I thought that was really cool. And also, of course, they have the ability to recycle nutrients back into the soil, not only with plastics, but of course, everything else. They're able to chemically break down the nutrients in any of the organic matter that they find and then redistribute that. That's one huge role. Parasitic and pathogenic fungi are able to control tree and plant populations. Obviously, they have these parasitic relationships with them, but they also and this is where we're talking about the carnivores, where they have the ability to feed on the parasites that feed on the trees and plants as well. So sometimes they can have these parasitic relationships with the trees, but they can also do something to help the trees also not die from certain things like nematodes and other infestations. And I know that that is one particular thing. Actually, before I get into that, because I know it's later on, I I'm gonna save that for later. But I put nematodes there in particular because there's one specific species that we're going to talk about that that does that I just think is really cool. But yeah, so they have those kind of roles. And then the next part, which I find really fascinating, and we're going to get into a little bit more detail after this, is the mycorrhizal fungi, where they form these relationships with the plants. And there are some ways that they're able to, I know that there's one way that they're able to effectively drill into the roots of the plants and like directly exchange nutrients that way. There's also some where they kind of like wrap around the roots and they kind of form this like com I don't know if it's like a I don't know, I want to call it a conversation, but it's basically just this you know, less invasive way to share nutrients that some plants are able to perform with fungi. And like we talked about, they make up 90% of the organic soil. So they also make up all of, you know, 90% of the soil that the trees and plants, you know, literally thrive on. So that's one of those cases where even dead fungi have such a crucial role. Um, and I know I mentioned this earlier, they can access elements like nitrogen and phosphorus from rocks and other places like that, so that they're able to make that accessible to plants and redistributing water. That's another part too, where especially because fungi are they really thrive in moist environments. That's one of those things that they're just like naturally really good at is redistributing water. Um, and we'll talk a little bit too about how like they use water themselves. But that's kind of just one key thing that they'll do for the environment that they're in. And yeah, recycling nutrients, we talked about that. And yes, okay, and then we'll talk about a little bit of the wood wide web that has as it's been coined of mycorrhizal fungi, which they help trees and other plants communicate with each other underground. This was something that's actually only recently, it recently is in like the 90s, has been discovered is that trees are actually able to communicate with each other underground via this wood wide web. And the like, it's been described as like the mycorrhizal fungi almost function as like the internet, where it's like this mass of roots um, that are able to grow around different species of trees and also redistribute nutrients and information and things like that between species. Um, and that's really cool. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Actually, I think it's this next section coming up. But yeah, so that is one of the coolest things that I really like about them, and that's why part of it is also really useful for our purposes in terms of identification, is thinking about the plants and trees that they like to join up with and they like to be friends with, are really helpful for us because then once we are able to identify the trees and the friends that they like to hang out with, then we'll have a little bit easier time finding the mushrooms themselves. Um, so obviously they play this huge crucial role for the ecosystems that they're in. They have this ability to transmit information and nutrients between not only their own species, but interspecies, which is just, I just find that so cool. And yeah, trees will actually give up, and I mentioned this earlier, but they've been known to give up to a third of their resources just to their fungal friends, which I just think is really cool. They are, and it's mainly these carbohydrates, these things that the mushrooms can't or the fungi can't produce themselves. They get these carbohydrates from the trees, in exchange for the nutrients and things like that. Which I just think is really interesting because it also shows how important that role is to the trees. In I remember reading this book that was called The Hidden Life of Trees. I don't remember who the author was, but that was where I learned that specific part of it was that these trees they rely on each other as well as just their own evolution to survive. And I just think that it's really interesting to see how they form these relationships with these fungi, these species that are completely in a different kingdom from them. They're able to form these relationships with and end up thriving, all of them because of it. So I just think that's just really fun. And I always get jazzed about it. That's one of those things that I just like can talk forever about. This is a short video that I wanted to show actually because I think it kind of perfectly sums up a lot of what we've been talking about, as well as just some really cool information. I think it's only like 4 minutes long or something like that. Yeah, it's 4 minutes. But it's basically just talking about like the roots of life on land, basically just talking about how mycorrhizal fungi have kind of shaped the way that life has been able to colonize land. So just let that play. Can everybody hear that okay? Is the audio working fine? Can you not hear it at all? Okay, that's cool. Um, all right, then I'll figure out how we can do that. Or Stephanie, if you might know how we might be able to get that.
I do not,
Okay,
unfortunately.
interesting. If we can't watch it, that's fine too. I'll be happy to improvise, but I thought I would be able to. There's not a ton of sound in the beginning.
So Steve is saying you have to hit share computer audio when you started the screen share.
I hope I did that, but if I didn't do that, then I wonder if I can figure out how to do that. Oh, okay. Let's see. Okay, I did something.
There you go.
There we go. Okay,
We're
great.
all good.
Before plant,
Perfect. I'll start from the beginning just so we can get some context.
before plants, land was scorched and desolate. Conditions were extreme. The ancestors of land plants were freshwater algae with no roots and with no experience foraging for nutrients and water from the ground. To survive in this new and inhospitable environment, they had to strike up relationships with another type of organism entirely: fungi. Fungi are largely invisible ecosystem engineers which live as networks of tubular cells called mycelium. Mycelial networks have no fixed shape. By remodeling themselves, they can expertly forage for nutrients and water from their surroundings. In their relationship, both partners were able to provide something the other could not. Plants turn sunlight and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into energy-rich carbon compounds, like sugars, which fungi needed to grow and survive. By partnering with plants, fungi acquired privileged access to these sources of energy. They got fed. In turn, fungi grew into exploratory networks that could forage for minerals and water from the ground. By partnering with fungi, plants gained greater access to these essential resources. They, too, got fed. As plants and fungi became more dependent on one another, plants evolved coarse, fleshy organs to house their fungal partners. By the time the first roots evolved, the relationship between plants and fungi was already tens of millions of years old. Fueled by high levels of light and carbon dioxide, plants spread across the world and evolved larger and more complex forms. As plants boomed, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere dropped by 90%, triggering a period of global cooling. These alliances evolved into what we now call mycorrhizal relationships. Today, more than 90% of all plant species depend on mycorrhizal fungi. Globally, the total length of mycorrhizal mycelium in the top 10 centimeters of soil is around half the width of our galaxy. The intimate associations between plants and fungi form an ancient life support system that easily qualifies as one of the wonders of the living world. In their exchange of energy and nutrients, plants and fungi engage in sophisticated trading strategies, striking compromises and resolving dizzyingly complex trade-offs. The influence of these quadrillions of microscopic trading decisions spills out over whole continents. Mycorrhizal mycelium is a sticky living seam that holds soil together. Remove the fungi, and the ground washes away. The carbon that floods into the soil through fungal channels supports intricate food webs. About 25% of the planet's species live underground. We are destroying the planet's fungal networks at an alarming rate through activities like industrial agriculture and deforestation. When we do so, we jeopardize the health and resilience of the ecosystems on which we depend. Organizations like SPUN and the Fungi Foundation are leading a massive global sampling effort to create open access maps of the planet's mycorrhizal fungal communities. These maps will support conservation projects and policies that aim to halt their destruction. Mycorrhizal fungal networks have sustained and enriched life on our planet. It's time they received the protection they deserve.
It was just a short video that I wanted to share just because I think it gave a lot of kind of a big picture image of what we've been talking about so far. These are just some of the big takeaways that I wanted to talk about. So like they talked about in that video, mycorrhizal fungi are crucial for up to 90% of plant species on Earth. Not only for their ability to just break down nutrients and access, or break down rocks and access the nutrients in them as well, but they're also just crucial for population control as well as sharing information between different species of plants and trees. And it's really only recently that we're starting to understand the depth and the complexity of these relationships that they have with each other. Yeah, so that was another part that I wanted to just talk about, was also just how they're threatened by mass deforestation like trees are. But by studying them and learning how to understand how they live, then we can understand how to protect them and how to preserve them. So these are just the big takeaways. Is there something else I wanted to mention there? I don't think so, other than just the fact that okay, I think I got to the big points that I wanted to talk about there. But yeah, I just thought that was really useful to kind of get some perspective on the global relationships that they have, so that we can then talk about, oh yes, another fun fact that I threw in there was that living mycelium, just living mycelium, sequesters up to 36% of CO2 emissions from fossil fuels every single year, which just blew my mind. Also was one of those things that I learned about as I was doing research for this presentation, and I was like, I have to fit this in somewhere. I don't know where, but it ended up being just a fun fact I needed to share, was that not only are trees really useful for sequestering CO2, but obviously just living mycelium alone plays a huge role in that as well. So just had to toss that in there. Now we're going to get to fantastic fungi and where to find them, is what I ended up calling this section. But I'm just going to go over a little bit of a lot of different areas of mushroom identification. There are over 3,000 species in Maine alone. Globally, I think there's like tens of thousands. I honestly could have double checked on that number, but we have just a lot of species in Maine. And since we're specifically talking about the Bangor Land Trust, in peatlands alone, there's over 600 different species. A lot of them, like I said earlier, they are gravitating towards these moist environments. They really thrive there. So having moisture. And I think another part of this, there we go. Basically, if we forget everything else that I've said and just learn one thing, is that moisture and substrate are huge predictors in where you're going to find fungi. Obviously, there's a lot of variability in those two things. But that's kind of the basic idea, is when you're looking for species, you're really looking for where you think you might find them. Because obviously they're immobile and they are going to gravitate towards moisture and nutrients. But this is also to say that it's kind of complicated to identify mushrooms down to species. It's really difficult. And even when I was in the Maine Master Naturalist class, there are a lot of cases where we couldn't identify down to species, but we were like, hey, this is a really cool bolete, for example, or this is a really cool cap and stem mushroom. And maybe we could get it down to like, okay, well maybe it's this specific genus or whatever. But yeah, it can be pretty difficult, especially because there are a lot of lookalikes. But we'll get into more of those kinds of things later on. But that's just some context I wanted to throw in. And oh yeah, substrate, we kind of talked a little bit about the types of things that they're looking for. But these are the things that we might be looking for when we're looking for fungi. I tend to always be looking at the ground or just anywhere on the ground for logs or branches or twigs. Some of them will grow right on the face of rocks, or like if there's any like some of them will grow out of moss, for example. But there are some that will, and we'll get into species specifics later, but some of them only grow with like specific, like this conifer or whatever. Some of them are just looking for, dead logs, anything that they can grow on. And then some of them are going to be growing in the soil and they're going to be living off of whatever they find there. Some of that can be interchangeable, right? These were two examples of pictures of fungi that I found. And just kind of showing the variety of places that you can look, and also just how easily that they can kind of blend into everything else around them. But this is typically where I end up finding a lot of species, especially on logs and twigs. That seems like the majority of time. Like if I'm looking just to find any sort of mushroom, if I look at a twig or if I find a log, somewhere on that log or twig, there's going to be some sort of fungus. And it feels like 90% of the time. It's probably less than that. But so these are just kind of the basic things that we're going to at least be looking for if we're going out and trying to find some fun fungi. Next part. Okay, yeah. These are just some of the basic forms. Some guidebooks will have these kind of broken up into categories. I know this one, and this is the guidebook that I used the most as I was looking for all the information. It's just called Mushrooms of the Northeast. I know I have it written down later in the presentation, of like the authors, Teresa Marone and Walt Sturgeon. But that one in particular will break it down basically into like cap and stem with gills, cap and stem with with pores, and then they'll have like bracket fungi and jelly fungi and kind of break it up from there. But these are just general categories. Not every guidebook is going to call them the exact same thing. And some might also, they're kind of fuzzy around the edges. But these are just some things that you're going to see a lot in different guidebooks, or even just online, just to kind of help narrow down what we're looking at. And I'm going to go through also, because like the top layer that or the top level that I put up here are ones that I think are the easiest probably to find in the wintertime in particular. And those are the ones that I'm going to go into a little bit more in depth. The ones in the bottom, I'll also talk a little bit about, but it's going to be more brief just because those ones are going to be just a lot harder to find, or they really just don't show up in the wintertime that much. A lot of them are going to be ones that show up later in the year. That's not exclusive to all of them, but that's just kind of the the broad categorizations that I ended up making as I was trying to put this presentation together. Um, but yeah, so I guess we'll just get into the different types. Sac fungi, also called cup fungi. Sometimes they're called cup-like mushrooms, for example, but they're specifically part of this group Ascomycetes. There we go. Um, and this division is actually the largest of all different fungi. It makes up 64% of the species. Um, they are basically just they're usually cup shaped. Some of them are flatter than that. But they're usually differentiated from crust fungi, which I actually don't think I mentioned here, but that's another sort of form. It can look a little bit more like flat against the substrate. But sac fungi, cup fungi are going to be curled, or they're going to have a little bit more texture away from or yeah, I guess texture is the right way to put it, but like they're going to have a little bit more form attached to them. I found out that if any of you know morels are technically sac fungi, which I didn't realize. But there's different, there's a bunch of different examples, but most of them are typically going to be saprobes, so they're going to be growing on some kind of organic material. These ones look like they're primarily on substrate. I know the one in the bottom left is one that I took a picture of, and that was growing on the face of a log. Um, but these other ones are growing on other forms of substrate, but it's all, this organic material. Sometimes it'll be buried beneath the soil, and that's something to also consider when you're looking at, like, if you find a mushroom, you want to make sure you know exactly what it's growing on, because sometimes, especially the ones that are growing, like, if they're growing out of the soil, or they look like they're growing out of the soil, sometimes it's worth gently kind of digging around to see if it's actually growing directly into the soil, like the roots are spreading into the soil, or if they're technically colonizing like a branch or something that's just kind of buried underneath the leaves or whatever. Um, and these are the ones, this one and jelly fungi, which I don't remember if it's after this or a couple after this, but these are the ones that I also tend to find on like twigs and things like that. And yeah, so sometimes they can be buried. So keeping that in mind is helpful. But was there anything else I wanted to mention here in particular? I don't think so. Uh, yeah, yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, and they're made in this. The reason why they're called Ascomycetes is because they're made in this. The spores are made in this sac-like mother. It's called an ascus. But the spores are kind of made in this little sac, and then they get dispersed. Some of them just get like launched up. Some of them get just dispersed in the air. But yeah, those are the basics. And yeah, that was also another thing that I didn't know, is that 64% of species are sac fungi, which is just really interesting that it's a majority of them. I wouldn't have guessed that. But the bigger fungi that are more prominent that we're going to see a lot more commonly, especially in the winter, are these polypores, these conchs that are usually, like I showed earlier, they are really tough, and because of that, they can last for a year or more, individual specimens. So they're really good candidates to find during the cold weather. I find a ton of polypores and turkey tails and these reishi all over the place during the winter because they're just so sturdy. Um, and that's another thing about some other species that we're going to talk about later, is that that sturdiness is really important for, whether or not you're going to be able to find a specific species in the winter time because of how harsh the conditions can be. So yeah, so they're typically growing in shelves. Polypores just means, many pores. These are specifically ones that are shelf fungi that have pores as opposed to gills. I typically find that the ones that have gills are a lot softer and not as firm. And so there are still some that grow in the wintertime and colder weather, but uh the quality of them once you actually find the specimen can vary greatly with a lot of those softer ones. So that's why they can be kind of harder to find. But these polypores are a lot easier to spot. And are some of them are also parasitic, but some of them also don't have any effect on the tree whatsoever. There are also some that are like technically parasitic, but like I think birch polypore in particular, like they're technically parasitic, but they, as far as I know, those ones in particular they're not usually the thing that ultimately kills the tree. Usually the tree dies before it can actually kill the tree. Because like a birch polypore, for example, can take like 10 years just to actually make a huge dent in the health of the tree. So when they're growing at these really slow rates, sometimes they don't really, sometimes they can technically have a relation, a parasitic relationship with the tree, but the effect isn't, uh, terribly immediate or anything like that. But so yeah, so these are the ones that I find all the time. I think all three of these pictures I took like this winter. And I could probably still find all of these specimens if I went out and looked for them too. And yeah, was there anything else that I needed to mention there? I don't think so. So we're going to move on to the next one, which are very similar to the other ones, these shelf, these bracket fungi, but these ones are gills. This bottom one is technically, when I was looking it up, it's technically a shelf mushroom because it grows perpendicular to the tree. Um, Even though it has a stem, and there are some species like that. Oysters can sometimes grow stems even though they're still shelf-like, so they can have these longer stems, but that's something that you might even see in certain guidebooks that will mention like they sometimes they can look like they have a stem, but they don't really have one. Or like um I know when I've grown oysters, for example, because just I have the picture of the oysters reminded me. When I've ordered like the North Spore boxes, for example, where you can just kind of grow your own mushrooms, some of them will grow longer stems when they're inside, and I found out it's because of like the way that the air moves around them, I guess, is like if they don't it's something to do with the air quality. Like if they don't have enough fresh air around them, they're more likely to grow longer stems. Which I just thought was interesting. Um, and what was the other part? Yeah, this is another case where like they're not usually gonna some of them are parasitic, some of them aren't. Um, and they'll typically grow in these shelves, but these ones are specifically brackets that have these gills rather than pores. And they still spread spores the same way, but these ones also, and when we talk about spore prints later, which are basically just when you collect a spore print of all of the spores they drop at once, you get some really cool spore prints out of these guys because of the shape of the sort of fan shape of their gills, and those can be helpful in identifying down to species as well. But yeah, so oyster mushrooms, train wreckers, the variolel, whatever species. All of these are different types of these brackets with gills. And we'll get into oysters in particular later. But those are just kind of basic things to remember. These tooth fungi, I also wanted to mention just because they can kind of take on a lot of different shapes. Some of these are just I like one of the books that I used. I don't remember if it's the Mushrooms of the Northeast or um, the Fantastic Fungi one, but some of these will just be kind of lumped into like a miscellaneous category or something like that. Some of them will be given their own spot. But tooth fungi, also known as hydenoid fungi, that was another thing that I didn't know about until I was doing this presentation, was hydenoid refers to hydnum-like, which is a Greek term for truffle. It was actually one of the first terms that was used when the taxonomical structure of scientific nomenclature was starting to be developed. It was one of the first, I don't remember exactly which species it was, but it was one of the first groups of species that were given these taxonomical Latin names. And yeah, it basically just refers to these fungi that use these tubular, like almost stalactite, I think it's stalactite that hangs down structures to spread spores, which are kind of like these tubes, the tubes that we talked about earlier, but they just kind of hang down. So lion's mane are technically toothed, but you'll also have some that are fuzzier, like this guy, that are sometimes they'll be fuzzy on the top as well as on the bottom. Some of them will just have these tubes hanging down from the bottom. But those kinds of details are also super helpful in identifying for those reasons, because there's also just so much variety in how those teeth can look. Um, and was there anything else I mentioned? I don't think so. Yeah, and the next part is also jelly fungi, which is kind of similar um, in some cases to sac fungi, in that you can find them in some pretty similar places. Um, but these guys, in particular, I'm a fan of witch's butter, just because of how cool and kind of like almost like slimy and brainy it looks. It looks like, but they're basically just these soft little jelly guys. I think there may even be some conversation about like whether or not they're sort of their own thing, maybe outside of fungi, but for now we're lumping them all together because they grow in very similar places in similar ways. Um, but yeah, so they'll primarily grow on wood substrate, so twigs and logs and things like that. One source I found said primarily hardwood sticks. Identifying twigs can be a little bit difficult, and that's kind of a whole other conversation. So, but basically just knowing that they're really looking for just wood in general, but particularly any hardwood species like deciduous trees and things like that. Um, but they also get most of their shape. This is another part too. Like a lot of different species of fungi, they will get most of their shape when they're damp. So like the picture that I have on the bottom left was also another blurry phone picture that I had of witch's butter that I found specifically in the wintertime, specifically during, that one is a dry example. The one on the right in the top is a better example of what jelly fungi like a witch's butter will look like when it's moist or after rain, for example, where it kind of like it expands. And part of that is because the way that the cells of mushrooms interact with water is they basically like kind of like when you get like when you get one of those little like towels from the dollar store or something that just add water and it grows. Basically like that, where as soon as the cells are exposed to moisture of any kind, they will start expanding. And so it's really cool to also just go out and see if you find a specimen and you just like pour a little bit of water on it, that soon the color will start coming really vibrantly back to it, and it'll start growing a little bit more in size. Um, and so those are pretty cool. I think later on I also talk about specifically looking for witch's butter in particular. But those are just some key points that I wanted to mention about jelly fungi. Oh, I called them jelly I called them jelly babies because I think they're really cute. And I saw it referenced somewhere else, so it's scientific. Um and okay, yes, crust fungi. I'm glad that I remember that I put something in here. I call the cousin to crust lichen, because lichen also part of the structure of lichen involves fungi, and so they can grow in very similar places that you might find lichen. And some of them can be very firm, like the one on the top right. That's the zoomed out picture of the one that I had earlier of all of the spores. I mean, all of the pores, excuse me. But but yeah, so there's a lot of variability in how they might look. They're typically going to be growing on wood. Their fruiting body is going to be mostly flush with whatever the substrate is that they're on. Some of them can look a little bit like jelly fungi or like sac fungi, for example. And so sometimes you gotta kind of make sure that you've categorized them. But but yeah, so these are just also some examples that I wanted to point out, just because they can kind of come in a bunch of these really interesting forms. I think the ones that have these sort of, they call it bleeding. I've seen it in a number of other species as well. But this one I thought was really interesting because they kind of bleed these. I think that those are basically the way that they reproduce their spores, but I could be making that up. But they will produce this like these jelly beads almost on top of their fruiting body, and I just think that's so interesting. Um, that one in particular, the bleeding broadleaf fungus, that those ones will specifically grow on only broadleaves, only deciduous trees, essentially. Um, and I think that one may even be specific to like oak trees. And maybe just like oak trees and oak tree adjacent species. But yeah, these are just some kind of examples. The Rasules aleurodriscus. I don't know how to pronounce that. That's my best guess. That one is also in the same genus as I think it's the same genus as lobster mushrooms as well. Which are, I think, I don't remember if I mentioned them later on in the presentation. In case I do, I will leave it at that. But yeah, so these are just kind of what crust fungi can look like. These ones are also going to be, they're going to vary by species, by season, but typically these ones are going to be usually easier to spot in the wintertime. Um, and then the cap and stem mushrooms, which I kind of lumped together as both the gills and the boletes, or the ones that have pores. Because these ones, I mean, as we just see from these pictures, these were all kind of random pictures that I either found online or had myself, and they're primarily going to grow during the warmer months, right? Or some of them will grow specifically. The mushrooms will grow in the summer months, but the mycelium might still be there. And the organism, some organisms can be decades to even centuries old, depending on the type. I know a lot of mycorrhizal fungi can live very long lifespans. But when they actually end up reproducing the mushrooms, sometimes they need very specific conditions, and sometimes that just means that they need warm weather to be able to do that. So I just wanted to kind of briefly mention them because they are obviously kind of the most iconic mushroom shape. And while we do see some of them in the wintertime, they're a lot harder to spot. They're also ones that are pretty delicate most of the time and can be easily damaged. So sometimes you might find just like a stem that's just poking out of the ground, for example. But I kind of wanted to just gloss over them because while they are super cool, they're not going to be super easy to find during the winter time. But yeah, so most of them are going to be primarily growing in the soil. Most of them are going to be mycorrhizal. But that being said, there are some species that grow on wood. For example, this honey mushroom, which we'll talk, I know we'll talk a little bit about later, but these ones are, they only produce during the summertime, but they're still but the mycelium is still colonizing that log, right? So like it's still able to obtain these nutrients. It's just not going to be reproducing visibly, but you can still find them. And I think the next part, okay, yeah. Next part is just all going to talk briefly about puffballs and corals because these are also some that primarily grow directly from the soil and are going to be harder to find. Um, and they also typically, I know puffballs specifically are only going to grow mushrooms during the warmer months. But they'll still be mycelium during the winter. They're just going to be a lot harder to find. Um, they can have mycorrhizal and saprobe species, or just ones that kind of flip-flop in between. They're super cool. The corals and puffballs are both kind of interesting in that they have really specific um, and really kind of unique shapes to them. The picture that I had on the left was a spiky puffball in particular, but some of the more common ones that I end up seeing during the warmer months are these kind of smooth puffballs that are almost entirely spherical. Sometimes I know in one guidebook I have, it specifically refers to them as like spherical mushrooms. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to throw those in there just to throw in a little honorable mention for our fun fungi friends that we might not necessarily see this time of year, but they're still out there. So now we're going to get into some species specifics, and some that we're going to actually see during the winter time, or at least see evidence of during the winter time. And so we're going to start with the honey mushroom. The Armillaria genus in particular has a lot of different species. But they're typically called honey mushrooms because the mushrooms themselves look like these kind of honey-colored cap and stem mushrooms. They produce the mushrooms during the warmer months, so you might not necessarily see those guys. However, they produce this black shoelace-like structure of this mice of basically it's called the rhizomos, but it's rhizomorphs, but these strands of hyphae that in the winter time, honey mushrooms primarily will colonize dead logs as well as living logs, but they will, I think they prefer the dead ones. But in wintertime, they're going to be found on those logs, and you can find evidence of these rhizomorph structures on these logs, and that can be a great indicator of honey mushrooms that are growing there. Because that's also a great way to check for armillaria root disease in trees and other things in your area, where these do technically, especially when they're on living trees, they can produce this like root rot, and they can parasitize trees and be responsible for crown thinning and like these branches dying back. And it can be pretty deadly, or pretty at least painful for younger trees in particular. So having a little bit of an idea of where they might be growing in a particular area might at least be helpful in the later months when we're thinking about protecting our own trees and things like that, and also just kind of keeping an eye on the population control that the honey mushroom is trying to do for us, but may not always be what we want it to do. So, like other species, they can be parasites, they can be saprotrophs, they can be mycorrhizal fungi. There's a lot of just variability in how they can survive. But typically, what I've ended up seeing is that they like to colonize dead logs, or they'll occasionally be on living trees. But I know I didn't have any good pictures myself. I ended up having to find that picture of the black shoelace structure. But yeah, once you start seeing it, you start to realize like, oh, they're kind of everywhere. And but then in the warm months, you can also come back and expect to see a little honey-colored mushroom pop up. Um, and yeah, so that's kind of just basic what you might expect if you were looking for honey mushrooms in particular. But if you just come across anything that kind of looks like that, it's probably a honey mushroom. Um, Birch polyphores, those ones are usually, I find them pretty easy to identify just because they're going to be primarily growing on birch trees, like the name suggests. They are polypores, so they're going to be shelf mushrooms that have these pores on the underside. Um, they are more common on dead logs, and stumps than living trees, but I still see them on living trees all the time as well. Um, they can act as both parasites and decomposers of the wood, so they can cause brown rot, but they do have this role in breaking down the wood after it dies, or after the tree dies. Um, and this is one of those cases where the fruiting bodies can last for more than a year. I have also found that these ones are usually easy to preserve. I wish I had an example to show, but I found that these ones, if you find a lot of them, can be kind of fun to preserve just because they're kind of like this perfectly little round mushroom, and if you look at the pores underneath, it can look really interesting seeing how they're all just kind of parallel structured together, almost like honeycomb in a way, where they're kind of just fully like nicely packed together. Um, the spore print, which I don't think I mentioned for the honey mushrooms, I think the honey mushrooms usually have a creamy to like brownish color spore print. But birch polypore have a spore print that's white. So if you just left a paper underneath them, for like a day or so, they typically recommend, if you're going to do that, to like get a specimen, get the cap, put it on a piece of paper, and then like put a bowl over it or something so it doesn't get disturbed. Um, but some guides are just going to give you, the color of the spore print. And sometimes you can even just see that color in nature. I know I found some examples before of mushrooms that had recently dispersed all their spores, and just like the ground below them was all like a pale whitish gray, for example. So there are some cases like that, where it's a little bit easier, but yeah, spore print white. I mentioned a little bit about what they look like. But some key things just to keep in mind, especially when they can look pretty similar to they're called tinder polypore, which can also grow on birches as well as other types of trees, but they're both technically also they're regarded as inedible, but they like technically like they won't kill you if you eat them, essentially. Um, but these guys, birch polypore in particular, have this sort of smooth cap that is typically brownish to creamish white. Um, but usually there's very few markings on the cap. There's usually no like evidence of like a universal veil or anything like that, where they would have like anything covering the cap. It's usually pretty smooth, except for any sort of cracks in the skin that you might find from like just you know damage or whatever that happens to them. But it'll expose this sort of paler flesh underneath. So that's something that's also kind of useful to keep in mind. And like I mentioned earlier, they're also really firm. Sometimes they can be soft. They can be like slightly soft, or at least softer than the wood, is how I described it here. Because like I said, they get a lot of their structure just from the wood that they're growing on. And so they won't be as tough as the wood, but some of them can be very, very firm, and can feel almost as as tough as the wood. But usually when they're still living like that, they'll still have some slight give to them. And I wanted to mention too, because I thought it was really interesting, that the Tyrolean Iceman, who was mummified over 3,000 years ago. Actually, no, it would be more than that. It would be 5,000 years ago, if I'm doing the math correctly. Um, plus a few hundred, was found with birch polypore, because it has long been regarded as a medicinal mushroom. And that was found with this mummified body from 5,000 years ago, which I just think is really cool. There were also, I think, some species of like tinder polypore as well, which is one of the ones that I mentioned earlier. Tinder polypore, when you're specifically comparing these two, those ones have usually these kind of colored bands around them. But those ones, the tinder polypore, I've heard are actually really good for actually starting fires. That's why they're called tinder polypore. Um, is because you can use them to catch fire in the wilderness. So that's just a fun fact in case you're ever stranded on a desert island. Um, but yeah, so really cool. They've been around forever and people have been using them forever, which I think is really fun. Witch's butter, which is part of the one of the jelly fungi that I mentioned earlier. These guys are really cool because they can take on these really bright colors. I typically tend to see them in this almost like yellowish orangey color. Some of them they can even look a little bit translucent when they're wet. And so they look very alien almost when you find them. But yeah, the spore print's going to be white to yellow. I've typically seen like a very, very yellowish kind of color around them, but I honestly haven't seen too many specimens that have actually released spores, so I can't say from personal experience, but yeah, and they're going to be because they're so reactant to water, especially, they're going to be very easy to find in very moist environments. These are also ones that I tend to find like just on all sorts of wood or detached branches or anything like that. They are usually going to be on logs and branches. And they're either going to be a decomposer or saprotrope or a parasite. Um, oh, and this is another description that I found that was kind of useful is that they're described sometimes as breaking through the bark. And if you like look at them really closely, you'll kind of see that they'll start from growing through these cracks in the bark. Um, and sometimes you can see like larger areas where you can see kind of where it start to grow through the substrate. Which is kind of cool. And so when they're dry, you'll see them still with some of that color, but it'll be a little bit more diffused. And I don't know if I ended up putting a picture. I don't think I ended up putting one, but I did have one that was basically just showing it underneath some snow and how like you can still very much see the color, but it's not going to be as like fully like fleshy like that. Um, but yeah, they really look kind of like gelatin when they're wet. And when they're dry, they're gonna look kind of tough and immovable. But yeah, those guys are really cool because they have such a kind of smooth texture to them, but they still are really curly and kind of brainy. Yeah, I think those guys are really cool. I didn't put it here, but they do also have supposedly they have medicinal value. I haven't ever used them like that. I haven't ever used any of these guys like that, actually, but I have heard that they supposedly, I believe the witch's butter is supposedly said to help with like inflammation or something like that. More research needs to be done, but that's just another cool thing about them is that they've been at least used in medicine for millennia. And so those are just another one that's really cool. And I find those guys really just like anytime after it rains, any time of year, I'll find them. It might not always be the same exact individual, but they are pretty much just around all the time. And also just like a cool little guy to see out there. At least for me, just because I think just the fact that they can produce that really vibrant color on their own is just so cool to me. So oyster mushrooms. So we're going to talk a bit about oyster mushrooms. These ones, maybe people have a little bit more experience with, but there's 3 different species that can grow in Maine. But we're going to just talk about the one that's visible during the winter time. Um, but that one, the classic oyster, they're also called like white oysters. Um, Sometimes they have a little bit of like a grayish look to them. But they're also these bracket fungi. That are typically going to be growing on wood, usually on living or dead wood. But the ones that I've at least seen, or the types that I have seen that I would maybe think are oyster mushrooms, um, are usually growing on living trees. And usually like vertically standing ones, not like just fallen logs. Um, and their gills run down the stem, so they're that decurrent shape. And sometimes the gills themselves will be short enough that you might not necessarily notice them at first glance. But typically you'll be able to see that they have gills underneath. The upper caps are going to be smooth. Sometimes they have little wavy ruffles on the edges. Um, but most of the time they're going to be very smooth and round. The classic, oyster in particular is going to be, it can be up to 8 inches across, but it can be smaller than that. They're typically going to grow in these clusters as well. So you're not just going to find one of them, you're going to find a bunch of them like this. And one of the cool things that I kind of like about them too is that they are pretty fragrant when you get close to them. And they are technically edible. The scent is kind of like briny, almost like actual oysters. And also mixed with that kind of umami smell of mushrooms as well. I know from personal experience, because I mentioned before that I have a North Spore, or I've grown a lot of different North Spore boxes of different types of mushrooms, but the oysters I've definitely found in my house, they absolutely smell like oysters mixed sautéed with mushrooms, basically. And it's really interesting to think how they're able to kind of produce that scent out of just their own substrate and things like that. But yeah, so they're not going to have any sort of ring or skirt because they usually don't have a very prominent stem to begin with anyway. But there are some kind of comparable species that can have some skirts, so that's something just to keep in mind. And their spore print is going to be white to these ones in particular. The classic oyster is going to be white. There are some, the other two species are going to be closer to like the grayish to lilac kind of color. Um, and the classic oyster as well is another one that is going to be most common on, living in but deciduous trees in particular. But they can also grow in conifers. It seems like they mostly just prefer deciduous trees. So if you see any sort of tree, if you see a mushroom that kind of looks like an oyster mushroom, and it's especially if it's growing on a deciduous tree, that's a pretty good indicator that it's an oyster mushroom and not one of the other kind of lookalikes, which I wanted to mention. And that was one of the things that I wanted to put at the bottom, before I forgot was, that, it's good to also make sure that when you're trying to identify any species to look at, anything that might look alike to them because there's just so many species that look very similar to each other. And it can be pretty easy to misidentify them. And this is one case where oyster mushrooms like this, most of the species that they look like are not dangerous. But there is one that is kind of dangerous, or is at least supposedly led to some deaths if they were consumed. So I just want to mention that too, that these angel wings, which I didn't have time to find a picture for, but angel wings look very similar to the classic white oysters. But the caps are typically smaller, thinner, they'll look a little bit more translucent, and the edges will be a lot more ruffled. And that's just kind of a thing to keep in mind if you're really identifying any sort of species, or any sort of specimen, is always just look at what the other lookalikes could possibly be, just to like double check. That's something that I tend to like to do is when I'm like out looking for anything in particular, or even if I'm just trying to like identify something down to species, I'll like look up that species and then I'll look up what any sort of lookalikes might look like, so then I can kind of compare. And also knowing something like when a certain species grows or when a certain mushroom is in flush. So for these oysters, they're going to be present from early spring to early winter. So we might not necessarily see them right now, but like in a few weeks, we might start to see them a little bit more. And whereas angel wings are going to be primarily on conifers and primarily late summer through fall. So that's just kind of one of those things that's useful to think about is like, oh, okay, if I'm looking at the species, does this grow during this time? If it does, great. If it doesn't, all right, we'll move on to another one. But yeah, so just some of those things are kind of important to keep in mind. Was there something else that I need to mention? I don't think so. And I think, all right, okay, that's what I thought. So those are the big ones that I wanted to mention for species that we can identify now during this time of year, and also that are pretty easy to identify once you kind of know what you're looking at. And this kind of last part I just wanted to mention is some safety guidelines that I felt were very important to mention. One is don't eat anything that you're not 1,000% sure about, because there's just so much variety in how they can look, so many different forms that each individual can take, that trying to if you're very, very confident, I would still check with a professional. And I there's only really one species that I've ever felt comfortable recently anyway identifying and like putting in my mouth, which was a chicken of the woods. There are some species that are a little bit more foolproof in that you can't hurt yourself if you make a mistake. But pretty much 99% of species that you're going to find are they're going to have some kind of look-alike that could potentially be dangerous. So it's just, if you're going to eat anything, I mean, most of the time don't. But if you are going to think about eating something, it's always good to check with some sort of professional, or at least like triple, quadruple check all of the characteristics that you're looking at and all of that. And it's also useful to, if you can't do any of that for some reason, to at least eat a tiny bit of it and like see if you're okay. But like, again, it's one of those things where it's like, it's just best to leave it to professionals to identify, so that there's no chance of injury or anything like that. And then this other part that I wanted to mention, because it's more specific to Maine, but it's just something to keep in mind, is that in Maine, there are not any species that are going to be poisonous to touch. You can touch pretty much all of them and you won't get hurt. But there are some that if you inhale the spores, and this is like if you inhale a lot of them, it's specifically some of those, especially that are like, I don't remember what the name is, but essentially a lot of those ones that if you like step on them, like the earth stars, for example, if you like, you can kind of like add some pressure and they'll puff up a lot of different spores at once, like a cloud of spores. Breathing in those is not going to be great for you. I don't recommend it. But they're not usually, nothing's going to be poisonous just if you touch it. So there's no reason to be afraid of them that much. But just kind of keeping in mind that spores are microscopic, and if you inhale them in large quantity, there's a possibility of having allergic reactions and things like that, or like just irritating your sinuses and stuff. So, just some things to keep in mind. But I think that may be my last point. Oh, I do have one more point where it was just about, I wanted to mention something about foraging and just kind of like best practice. If you're going to go and actually like forage and try to pick any of them, which you're not necessarily going to hurt the species, like the individual, if you pluck them. Again, the mushroom is like the fruiting body, so it's kind of like the apple to the tree, where like you're not necessarily killing the tree by plucking the apple, but you are taking out this fruiting body from the environment. And so if you are going to do that, really only take what you intend to study. And it's best practice not to take more than half of the specimens that you find. But most of the time, you can just get away with taking a bunch of pictures and taking notes, and you can do a lot of identification from home that way. But helpful tools that I find really useful for identifying is hand lenses are really great to just get to kind of look at the specifics if you find a species that has really kind of intricate gills or something like that. Getting some of those details can be helpful. I put an identification app, but like you can really just use any website. I personally like iNaturalist or Seek because they can also be kind of useful, kind of like guidebooks, and that they can help narrow it down for you a lot. And it's also just another great way to kind of like double check, get a second opinion almost on what you're looking at. And paper, just having some kind of paper, multicolored is best, but having something to collect spore prints is going to be really useful. You can that's the one case that I would probably collect. I would actually like pluck a mushroom for, or at least get the cap of, just to do a spore print. But none of these are necessary. You don't need necessarily any of these. They're just going to be super helpful for giving you the most accurate information. And if you absolutely must pick a mushroom, which you know, you can, but like I said earlier, it's best to kind of just keep it where it's at. A nice small knife. I have one that's actually attached to my keys. That's just a small one that is good to get a clean cut that just kind of preserves the flush so it doesn't do any unnecessary damage to the mushroom or to the rest of the fruiting body. I also have a little kind of brush attached to that that just kind of helps get off any of the like dirt and bugs, but that's not fully necessary. Um, but if I were to go out and with the intention of collecting multiple specimens, I like to bring a small like basket of some sort just to have them in that also allows some airflow underneath. Like I have a woven basket that has some slats or some holes that help spread the spores while you're walking around. And that can kind of just help because if you're taking one out of the ecosystem, at least you can help it spread a little bit more of its spores as you're walking around. So those are just some things that I wanted to throw in there just in case. But with that, I think that is the end of the presentation. Thank you guys so much for listening to me. Thank you for coming. I am so glad that everybody came and that everybody was excited to listen to me talk for an hour and 40 minutes. These are some of the resources that I had. So if anybody needs any of that, you're welcome to take note. But with that, I think if we still have some time for Q&A, did people have any questions? Or I guess if you also wanted to put them in the chat, that's an option too. But I think at this point we could probably allow people to like unmute themselves if they wanted to. And ask any questions you guys may have.
No questions, I think it looks like. You covered so much
about
ground
everything
during your
Yeah.
talk, so it was truly truly wonderful. You crammed a lot in there. It was really really spectacular. So thank you so much for sharing all that information with us and taking the time to give this talk. It was really awesome. I do want to compliment you on your slides. It's just it was a visually appealing
Good. Thank you.
talk.
Yeah.
So it was really nice to look at along the way. So thank you so much for taking the time to put this together. If there aren't any questions, I just want to say thank you everyone for coming out. I did record this talk, so I'm going to have that recording available if you know anyone who wanted to see it, or if you have anything you want to look back to, just contact us at Bangor Land Trust. That's info@bangorlandtrust.org. We often offer talks like this featuring Maine Master Naturalists, so feel free to check out our website and keep an eye on that for future events as well. So with that, I will say thank you again, Nola, for that presentation, and thank you everyone else for coming, and I hope everyone has a great night.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Happy to see y'all.
Thank you. I learned a lot.
Good, I'm
Thank
so
you.
glad. Yay.